Ocean acidification and its effects on corals. Ocean acidification is caused by high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. The CO2 in the atmosphere combines with the H2O and creates an acid which can be deadly for corals and other fish. Very acidic oceans cause corals to bleach. This means that the corals turn white. This results in the loss of biodiversity. Corals get their color from a bacteria called Zooxanthellae or zoox. When the ocean gets too acidic, the zoox in the corals die off, leaving the corals a bleached white color. Zoox are symbiotic algae, which means they give corals their color and they provide them with oxygen. They're like our trees. The corals provide a zoox a safe environment to thrive. They also provide a supply of CO2. To see the effects in the ocean caused by CO2 and high levels of acidity, I conducted 2 experiments. One measured the effects of CO2, and the other showed what would happen if the shells were left in acidic liquid for 120 hours. This shows how I set up the experiment. Over here, I made sure that the lid was on tightly so no CO2 can escape. In this lab, I started off by adding 450 milliliters of salt water in a big jar. Then I placed a small jar upside down and scattered 15 grams of shells. Then I lit a candle and introduced CO2 into the jar. Using a CO2 gas sensor, I measured the CO2 that was introduced until the candle blew out. I continued to add more CO2 for another 4 more days. Some things that I realized at the end of my experiment was that each day the candle was produced more CO2 every day, meaning that on day 1, the CO2 that was introduced in the jar was 9,917, day 2 was 9,974, day 3 was 9,981, and day 4 was 9,983. Another thing that I realized that pH increased and it reached a stable point after day 2. From day 1, it was 6.5 and from day 2 to 4 was 7. On day 5, when I finished the lab, the shells were slimy and some lost a bit of their color. The ones that were delicate became clear. In this experiment, I compared the liquids that the shells were kept in and their conditions after 5 days. Container 1 consisted of 50 milliliters of vinegar, which had the pH of 3, and 5 grams of seashells. Container 2 consisted of 50 milliliters of salt water, which had the pH of 6.5, and 5 grams of shells. After leaving the shells in the liquid for 5 days, I measured the pH and observed things that happened to the shells. Nothing really happened to the shells in the salt water. However, the shells in vinegar depleted. Some lost very fine texture and others lost almost all of their colors. Also, compared to the salt water, the vinegar turned the dirtiest. Here it is after day 2 and here it is after day 5. From my experiment, I can conclude that if high levels of CO2 is introduced in the atmosphere, then not only the shells and corals are affected, but the pH of the water also changes. Also, the quality of the water changes. The water becomes much more foggier and dirtier. From experiment 2, I learned that high levels of acid in ocean can degrade the quality of shells and corals. This is just salt water, and this is the salt water that had the candle in it for 5 days.